I do a lot of maritime and coastal history. I did start out as a commercial fisherman, and I'll talk about a little bit about that because it's relevant. But much of my career is, in my mid-career was in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes doing marine archaeology and maritime heritage. And now I'm a professor of history and historic preservation at the University of West Florida down in Pensacola. So I've kind of been out all around the maritime world. So now I'm going to try to share my screen here and get into it. Okay. Okay. And well, as you know, the name of my book is Stories from the Wreckage, Great Lakes Maritime History Inspired by Shipwrecks. It's not your typical shipwreck book. And I don't know what's going on. My computer will not advance. Oh, there it is. Maybe that'll work. Okay. It's not your typical shipwreck book, as you'll see in a minute. It's more of a broader history, and it reflects my interest and upbringing in things maritime. For many people that write about shipwrecks and do history, shipwrecks are artifacts of the past. They're dramatic things that you can approach, but have never really been touched by. But I've been touched by them a lot, as have been all the folks that grew up in the area that I did. I dedicated the book to my dad, the late Captain John Odin Jensen, and all my other shipmates on Alaska and the Great Lakes who aren't with me anymore. And this is the Seafarers Memorial in Homer, Alaska. And I bring this up in the beginning because this book is inspired by the lives of people like the people that I knew. One of the things that you might not know about Wisconsin is that it has been a leader in maritime heritage preservation for more than 30 years. It fits into the state's really progressive history, thinking ahead. Wisconsin Historical Society that published this book, but also sponsored most of the studies that went into this book over the years, was established in 1846 before there was a state. Now that's pretty progressive in history things. And that's what they did with shipwrecks as well. The program was established in 1988 and it's still going strong. Of all the states, of all 50 states, you may or may not be familiar with the National Register of Historic Places. We think about those usually with buildings, but Wisconsin has more shipwrecks on the National Register of Historic Places than any state in the Union by a significant degree. And that's a reflection of the state's investment in its really important maritime heritage. And I was lucky enough to get in on pretty much the ground floor of this in 1989, 1990. So this book is, although I'm the author and the stories that I'm telling are ones that I've crafted, the underlying structure of it, the shipwreck investigations, the photographs, the beautiful photographs in the book by Tamara Thompson, these are all a product of literally the work of dozens of people over 30 years contributed into this. So the stories and the problems are my own, but this is really a labor of love and a labor of public history and archaeology. Just to note, if you buy the book, I don't get any royalties on it. Everything goes to the Historical Society, which is as it should be. These are public resources, and anything that's invested should go back to the public. So a little bit about me. This isn't a normal shipwreck book because I have a little more familiarity with them. I'm from Alaska, third generation. I grew up in what was, and still in some ways is, a maritime frontier. It was a fisheries frontier. I was born in Ketchikan, down in the southwest part of the state. Let's see if I can move things around here a little bit so I can get to them. Down into the southwest part of the state. But I grew up in Homer, Alaska. And this whole stretch of the Alaska coast from 1890s up really throughout the 20th century was was a maritime frontier one time, or one kind or another. So I grew up in a fisheries frontier in a small town. This is a picture of, and we will get to the Great Lakes pretty quickly. This is a picture of the Miss Arctic. It was a small crab boat. This picture's from 1963, right before the Great Alaska Earthquake, and all over the deck are king crab. This was during a great early king crab boom. And at that time, a 50-foot boat could put in, and this one did, 1.2 million pounds of king crab in just 6 weeks. My father, that boat sank shortly thereafter because of a storm and various things, and it sat on the bottom. My father salvaged it, had a construction company, refitted it, and he went back to commercial fishing, which was his first love, and he took me with him. So I started doing this when I was 10 years old. This is the same boat, the Miss Arctic. Many years later, 1981, August. She looks a little bit different with crab lights and sitting low in the water because she's tanked down with a live tank, and Augustine volcano in the background. It's a beautiful night. 14 hours later, the Miss Arctic was on the bottom again, and my crew and I were on a life raft paddling through heavy seas to get to the much larger Big Valley that rescued us. Some 20 years later, 25 years later, the Big Valley going out to the Bering Sea rolled over and went down with everybody but one person. I bring this up because there's stories here about maritime life in America that really transcends region and time. One of the lessons that I learned was that vessels have many lives. They can wreck more, they can sink more than once, and that they can change as pieces of technology. They can change as economic and cultural conditions change around the country. They're very sensitive indicators of this. The other part, again, is just to really underscore that for me, ships and shipwrecks are highly personal things, and I can't do anything but think about the people. And I also believe that they are not, that when we think about shipwrecks, they dominate a lot of the popular maritime literature, but there's a lot more to maritime history or the history of a ship than really its worst day, the shipwreck. After the Miss Arctic sank, my father died the year before, I kept fishing for other folks for a couple of years, and it was rough, a rough period in my life, and for reasons I still don't fully remember, I decided I wanted to go to college, and I ended up in January of about 1983, popping into Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. I'd never been to Wisconsin. I'd been west of the Mississippi River or east of the Mississippi River, so it was quite a shock. I thought I was trying to get away from the sea, and I missed it a lot. I was a fish out of water, it seemed. So I spent time wandering along the Fox River a lot. This is a picture of the old trestle there in the Fox River Valley. I would sit in the old student union at Lawrence, looking down at night over the Fox River, looking at the lights and the dams, imagining that I was back in the harbor in Alaska, thinking that, just imagining that I was near the sea. What I didn't understand, what I learned later, was that in fact, the Fox Valley and broadly Wisconsin is connected with the sea. This is a picture of the Fox River Valley, early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, and there's a big scow schooner there going through the locks. This town in the middle of Wisconsin, upriver from the Great Lakes, was part of what historians call the Atlantic world, an unrecognized part. And so, being in Wisconsin, I started to discover these things for myself. After I graduated from Lawrence, my summer job was to work as a relief engineer on the University of Wisconsin research vessel Neeskay, herself now a historic vessel, by the way, built in 1950. And it was really quite an experience. I didn't know the Great Lakes. I came on board, and it was my first direct encounter with 20th century Great Lakes culture and norms. The captain, Bob Pop, he was a great guy. He was a rough old cop from Beaver Island. He'd been a wheelsman on car ferries, and he just he didn't know what he thought about this guy from the Pacific Ocean, from the West Coast. I made a mistake of questioning, asking about the anchor on the boat, and it turned out that it was his pride and joy. I stepped on a few things. I made the coffee much too strong. 3 tablespoons, no more. So I felt a little bit out of sorts. But then there was one day when we were with the DNR, and the DNR passed over some fresh whitefish. Again, I wasn't familiar with these things in the freshwater lands. And Captain Pop looks at me and hands me the fish and says, "Cook them." I said, "Captain, I don't know how to cook whitefish." He says, "Your name's Jensen, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, you can cook it." And I did. And that was the beginnings of an understanding, really, of this connectivity between the Great Lakes, a place that seemed isolated, even to the people like Captain Pop by the late 20th century from the salt water, but was in fact not. That there was this really deep legacy and connection between the salt and the freshwater seas. The Great Lakes, as you know, are huge, but covers about 94,000 square miles. It contains roughly 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water. All these things we know pretty well. Estimates that there are between 5,000 and 10,000 historic shipwrecks. That's a pretty broad range, but there's a lot of them. And in Wisconsin, on the Great Lakes, there's roughly 700 records of roughly 700 historic shipwrecks. Not all of them have been found, but many have. So that's in Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. So roughly 700. It's a lot of wrecks, and wrecks that tell a really tremendous story. When I joined the Wisconsin Historical Society, or the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, as it will always be to me and most folks that are a little bit older, maritime things were, shall we say, not much consciousness of them in most parts of Wisconsin. Still is the case, but not like it was in 1988, 1989. If you think about the symbols, of Wisconsin in the 20th and 21st century, cows, cheese, the Green Bay Packers, beer and more beer, Schlitz, Pabst Blue Ribbon. But when we go even deeper into things like that, the maritime elements come out. Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, named after Captain Frederick Pabst, who'd been a steamboat captain on the Great Lakes, who married a brewer's daughter and took it over, maritime capital flowing on land. Captain Pabst was one of the led a boat coming out to in an 1856 rescue of people from the burning steamer Niagara. So the connections are there. The iconography of Wisconsin still today, it's cows and cheese. We got our 2004 the quarter. But if we go back into the 19th century, to the early days of Wisconsin as a territory and as a state, things are very different. This is a picture of an image that was submitted to be a Wisconsin territorial seal. They had a competition on this, and it didn't win, but it was considered sort of the state, or in this case, the territorial seal. And I want to bring it to your attention because these territorial, this kind of iconography really captures the moment in time. And in this one, it's significant. At the very center of the seal is this. It is a Great Lakes Palace steamer, billowing smoke. It's going down the lake, and in front, this is a steel-bladed plow. It is a thoroughly modern agricultural instrument. We look at it and see quaint, but somebody looking at this from 1837 eyes, this is cutting-edge technology. This is the future, and for them, the future of Wisconsin was this marriage of the maritime components of the inland sea and of course the fertility of the lands. We can see this more broadly across the Great Lakes and other iconographies. This picture of two hairy guys was a part of a medal that was struck to commemorate the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825. You note the term, the union of Erie with the Atlantic. This idea, again, Erie being freshwater, represented by Pan, linking up with the Atlantic, Neptune, and it was part of this larger idea of connecting the heartland of the United States and its waterways with the sea. And it's not just here; you can see it all throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, and of course, culminating in the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's a really important driver of how people thought about the region and how to understand it from the past. But it's a perspective that certainly by the 1980s and 90s it kind of largely disappeared, even for the folks that were out on the Great Lakes as part of that community. These are later versions of the Wisconsin state seal. And I bring it up, one, because it's on the versions of this, and we'll see it in a second, of course, are on the Wisconsin state flag. And again, these things, this tells a story beyond just a symbol. One of the two figures on the flag and on this early seal, which again was developed in the late 1840s and elaborated in the 1850s, is this guy here. He's a mariner, he's a sailor. And the thing that's important to see is he's wearing a blue jacket. He's got, he's got all of the tarpaulin hat. He's got all of the visual symbols, clothing symbols of the Atlantic mariner. And this was the great age of Atlantic seafaring. It's not an accident that they're choosing a salty sailor, an image of a salty sailor to be on the Wisconsin symbol, because those same salty sailors, and there's a slightly different version of it, this is late 1850s, you can see a sextant. These salty sailors were the very people who were also, to a large extent, sailing and developing the maritime elements and building the ships of the Great Lakes and the inland seas. And of course, here's the latest, the later version, the current Wisconsin flag. I think the quality of the imagery has deteriorated over the years, but it tells a similar story. If we think about the history in broader terms, this is a map, a French map from roughly 1690, and it takes a second to orient yourself. We've got the Great Lakes over here, and this is New France. Here's the Atlantic Ocean. We've got the connections with the St. Lawrence River on out to the Atlantic. And here is the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, a great center of wealth and development. It was a cash cow of fish. The thing to note here is this is France's conception of New France at this point in time. And they see it as this integrated maritime enterprise. They don't see the Great Lakes as being in isolation with this larger maritime world that determined the boundaries of empire. This is the 1693 map, much less elaborated, Florida and the Great Lakes of Canada. You can, it's got the coastal features. But the thing to note here again is the prominence of water and waterways in this French vision. Of course, here's the Mississippi River, and there's Missouri, and there's other connectors to the Great Lakes. But so the point is in the early founding period of the Euro-American incursion or movement into the Great Lakes region, they saw it in this larger, grander international maritime context, not as an isolated inland sea. One of the ways to think about shipping and shipwrecks, and I will get to shipwrecks, is to think about frontiers. I opened up the talk mentioning that I grew up on a frontier, and it's important because frontiers have certain properties. You can see them archaeologically, sort of through the patterns of shipwrecks and other depositions. For Wisconsin and the Great Lakes, there's at least 5 for the period that we're looking at that overlap. Kind of a colonial military maritime frontier that was most of the activity. Again, we're looking at the Euro-American side of it, not Native American, although that's very much a part of the story. Pioneer settlement, commercial, lumber, and industrial, and all of these are connected with the story of ships, shipping, and shipwrecks on the Great Lakes and in Wisconsin. I'm a numbers guy to an extent, which would be a shock to my math teachers from high school. But this map, or excuse me, this chart shows two things. It's got dates on the bottom. So this is to 1825, and then it's in 10-year increments at 1825 to 1834 on up by the decades. The green bar reflects the number of ships that were built in that year on the Great Lakes that ultimately wrecked in Wisconsin. Again, there's about 700 or so, and I'm sorry that the numbers didn't come in. But you'll note that there wasn't a lot going on. You get a little bit of bump from 1825, but really you start to get some presence in the shipwreck record and maritime activity in the mid 1830s. But by the mid 1840s, it starts to take off, and the significant majority of all the ships that wreck in Wisconsin, historic shipwrecks, were built someplace on the Great Lakes between 1845 and 1874. In terms of tonnage, there are bigger things that come afterwards. But the other thing to note is the red bars, which is the decade of shipwrecking, of shipwrecks. And not surprisingly, there's not that many in the beginning, and it's almost a perfect bell curve, if you want to say it. And it grows and gets more. And by the mid 1870s and early 1880s, it starts to go up, and it really peaks between the early 1880s and 1890s, and remains, this sort of decade here, the last quarter of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, is the period where the majority of shipwrecks occurred. And it's for reasons that we'll see in a little bit. These frontiers, in this case, the industrial frontier, brings a lot of pressure to bear. And one of the results is shipwrecks. This is a picture that is on the cover of my book, and I've used it as a teaching tool for years. I lived in New England for many years and taught in Woods Hole and Connecticut and places like that. And I would put this image up and I'd ask my students, well, what is this? It's obviously a shipwreck. It looks like a Walt Disney shipwreck. Where do you think it is? And, they assume it's in the Atlantic. And when I tell them that, in fact, this is a piece of Atlantic world material culture, of Atlantic technology, and it's sitting north of Milwaukee, it surprises people. This is very much a product of again, the Atlantic world technology, the shape, the form of the vessel, the anchor that you see. All of this are pieces of hardware and technologies that would be found and recognized all throughout the Atlantic world. And we can extend beyond that to the language of the sea as well that is used. The Great Lakes were an extraordinarily creative and dynamic maritime space in the mid part of the 1900s. This was, it was the peak of American shipbuilding everywhere. It was we rivaled England. We built the best wooden ships in the world everywhere. But the most creative space, I would argue, was the Great Lakes, which is a surprise because, again, it was this frontier region. One of the technologies that take shape really quickly on the lakes are these palace steamboats. This down here on the bottom is the Palace Steamer Niagara that I write a lot about in the book. It was built completed in 1846 in Buffalo, New York. It was the second largest passenger steamboat afloat in the world at that time. This is the Empire, which was the first largest, which was built launched in Ohio. It was a big deal. You'll notice this image of the Empire, which is 260 feet long, embracing all kinds of new hull technologies and engineering technologies. It was such a big deal that they commissioned music, in this case, the Empire Quick Step, for its launching. One of the things that I, again, have explored really closely over the years is this idea that the Great Lakes are separate from the ocean and the Atlantic, that the salties are different, that there's a a trope in a lot of the popular literature and even professional literature that diminishes the Great Lakes and the ships that it was built as somehow inferior. Now, this guy up at the top his name is Stevenson, and he is David Stevenson. He is a pretty famous guy. He's part of an engineering dynasty from Scotland. He's a relative, an uncle of Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island, of course, and other great books. Robert Louis Stevenson was a disappointment to the family because he didn't build lighthouses. He wasn't an engineer. This Stevenson comes to the United States in 1837 as a young guy. He just finished his studies, and he went abroad, as many did in that period, to see the Americas and to travel the West, and he does. He travels all around the country, and his eye, of course, is the eye of an engineer, and he writes a lot about what he sees, about the harbors he sees, about the ships, about structures. And when it comes to the Great Lakes, he is extraordinarily impressed. And he gets back to England, and he quickly writes a book, fortunately, that tells us what he says. And when it comes to, and of course, he's writing to an English audience, not Americans. And when he gets back, he writes that when the Great Lakes are, quote, viewed in connection with the river and Gulf of St. Lawrence, and by which their surplus waters are discharged in the Atlantic Ocean, the ideas of magnitude and wonder are excited in the mind, which is impossible to describe. In describing the lakes, Stevenson urged his readers to abandon any preconceptions about bodies of fresh water. The Great Lakes, he explained, are, quote, vast inland sheets of water, and, quote, bear a much closer resemblance to the ocean than the sheltered bays and sounds in which the harbors of the east coast of the North America are situated. I'm reading a few passages from my book here. When he gets to Buffalo, New York, he looks at the 3-mile-long breakwater and masonry-covered piers, and he notes, one might fancy oneself in some seaport, forgetting altogether that he's on some freshwater lake. He judged these and other Great Lakes harbor works as better able to resist, quote, the fury of the winds and waves than the comparable wooden structures found in the ports of the northeastern United States, i.e. New York, Boston, places like that. So this is a voice from that period, an extremely knowledgeable voice, an international voice, looking at this region with an engineer's eye and seeing a maritime frontier of oceanic proportions and a place of extraordinary engineering vitality. And he writes more about the steamers and noting that they're really the best and most seakeeping in the United States. This period, during this period of these palace steamers, of course, ships and shipping are really important for Euro-American settlement, and in the book I talk a lot about that. There's other things going on in this period. It overlaps with a commercial frontier as well. If you were out on the lakes in the 1830s, in 1840s, and you went aboard a schooner, there's a good chance that it would be carrying a diversity of cargoes, groceries, and as well as other commodities. That changes later, but ships are really central to commercial activity during this period. Again, there's no railroads, and canals are really getting started. A frontier that is very important for the Midwest and for the shipwreck and maritime story is the lumber frontier. When you look at the hundreds of Wisconsin shipwrecks, of those that we know the cargo it was carrying when the ship went down, the most common cargo by a large factor were forest products of one kind or another, and you can probably guess why that might be the case on some of these. Just looking at the stacks of lumber. Industrial frontier. This is another one of my teaching photographs. I used to show it out east and ask people where they thought it was, and I told them it was the Great Lakes, but they would assume it was Chicago or Detroit or something like that. But in fact, it's Manitowoc, Wisconsin, in the early 1880s, and it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the activity, of the commerce, of how central it was to the Wisconsin experience. Stepping back from it, with a historian's eye, we can look at the Great Lakes by the end of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, and even more, as the world's most efficient industrial waterway. That maritime commerce was part of a complicated industrial system, that it was part of the foundations of American military and economic power. And it was also, by the beginning of the 20th century, home to the busiest ports in the world by tonnage as industrial harbors. So we go in a really short time from those small schooners to paddle wheel steamers to ginormous modern style but distinctive cargo carriers. This is the William Snyder, against a photograph that's in my book. It was built in 1903, and it carried cargo under its own power for well over a century. It's still, to the best of my knowledge, working as cut down as a barge, but still for more than 100 years, about 110 years, it steamed the Great Lakes. You don't see that anywhere else in the industrial world at sea, as far as I know. And it was, although this is an extreme example, one of the characteristics of Great Lakes ships and shipping in the 20th century is their great longevity. The old vessels hung around for a long, long time. And that suggests really important things about how effective the process of design had been. This is sort of the end of the story in some respects of the sort of technological creativity on the Great Lakes, industrial Great Lakes. Again, just to really point out how important it was in the 19th century. If we look at all of the records of all of the voyages, commercial voyages coming in and out of American ports, and the government kept track of that because taxation on maritime commerce was the most important source of revenue for the government throughout most of the 19th century. So they were counting this stuff. And if we count the number of vessels that are going from one American port to another American port, domestic voyages, the most common kind, whether it's on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, the Pacific Coast, that's the most common kind. There was about 77,000 voyages that they counted in 1871, is kind of a benchmark year. 50,000 of them were on the Great Lakes. When I went out to the East Coast for the first time in 1996, and was lucky enough to study under a number of really famous Atlantic maritime historians. Their attitude to the Great Lakes was it was kind of cute, and I was working on a bunch of really pretty groundbreaking scholarship and pointing these things out, and this is kind of my response to them. It's like, okay, it's kind of cute, but it's where the action really was. So again, just to get back into shipwrecks, where this is that chart of looking at the number of wrecks by decade period in Wisconsin, and we can see that it really peaks here with between the 1870s and the early part of the 20th century. It's a vast majority of them, and that is because of industrialization. When vessels age, but the power of industrialization, the discovery of iron ore on the Great Lakes intensifies things a lot, and we can see that in the archaeological record. I'll jump ahead. This is a site plan of the schooner Lucerne, which is resting in fairly shallow water up in the Apostle Islands in northern Wisconsin. It went down in 1886. On our last voyage of the year, carrying a load of iron ore. All hands were lost. And we reconstructed that pretty effectively through archaeology and history. And did that years ago. It was one of the first wrecks I worked on in Wisconsin. For this book, I went back to the Lucerne and looked into her ownership and her captain, but particularly her owners. And this is her principal owner, James Corrigan, who was an entrepreneur from Cleveland, from the Ohio area. He grew up and was a friend of Rockefeller. He and his brother were sort of hardscrabble semi-orphans who came and started to make a living on the lake, but they were always a bit dicey. Got involved in oil quite early and made some money, but would still invest in lake ships. Corrigan by the 1880s is heavily involved heavily invested in the iron ore trade, and he starts buying vessels like the Lucerne, big sailing vessels that then they could also tow around as schooner barges. And Corrigan exemplifies this industrial capitalism. In the 1890s, in 1899, when he predicts a boom in commerce, he buys 16 older vessels. This has been his pattern to add to his fleet. In less than 10 years, 9 of them had sank. At least 2 of them, including vessels almost identical to this Lucerne, went down with all hands. He talked about the survival of the fittest, and so well over, in terms of the total ships he owned, two-thirds of them ultimately sank. One of the worst records that I know of on the Great Lakes, but not because he was a fool, but because he understood and cared. He understood business, and he did not seem to care about the people on board the ships. We can expand that attitude out to much of the Great Lakes, not with the precision and perhaps the success or tragedy that Corrigan brings to bear, but it is a flavor of that period, and we can see it in the shipwrecks in so many different ways. Corrigan had he paid for this, at least in terms of karma. In the early part of the 20th century, he buys a yacht, an 84-ton sailing yacht, one that had competed successfully in an early America's Cup. And he and his brother go on a trip. They have their families on board. The 2 brothers get off, and their families continue on the vessel, and it is mishandled, and the vessel is blown over and sinks. And Corrigan's wife, 3 daughters, grandchild, nieces, and sister-in-law all die. He goes bananas on that, and does all kinds of things to try and find the bodies and all that. But it was a Great Lakes shipwreck, and one that all about karma. I wondered, and we'll never know, what he thought as he was searching for his family. And if he ever thought about the people, the families of the many men who died in his service. And I'd have to say not, because despite that tragedy with his own family, Corrigan continued and with his practices, and the 2 ships that you see here went down with all hands, after that. I'm going to shift a little bit, and I'll try to wrap this up so we can get to question and answers. The other flavor in this book, or probably the biggest flavor, is that again, this is all about how the Great Lakes are part of the Atlantic world, that it's a cosmopolitan place, at least in terms of its leaders. People came from all over. If you went on a sailing vessel on the Great Lakes, a commercial sailing vessel out of Milwaukee in the 1870s, only a little more than a quarter of the people you would encounter, based on the research that I've done, would have been born in the United States. Another quarter from Scandinavia, just under a quarter from Ireland, and Great Britain, Germany goes on down the pike. So it's a cosmopolitan, international body of laborers, which is consistent with ocean enterprise. In the book, there are a number of people that figure prominently, but these are 3 that illustrate the entrepreneurial spirit and the cosmopolitan nature, and they're each associated with 1 or more shipwrecks that are in Wisconsin. The guy on the left, the vessel on the left, is the lumberman, which is a lumber vessel, not surprisingly. built by Alan Litchfield, the schooner Kate Kelly, which is captained by Hartley Hatch, and the Frank O'Connor, which was built by and owned by Captain James Davidson of Bay City, Michigan. And underneath the images on top are actually underwater site guides that were developed based on archaeological information that divers use to guide their way around the wreck. I was involved in doing the Frank O'Connor map in 1990, and this was pre-zebra mussel days. And 4 of us seeing no more than 10 feet of visibility, usually less, mapped 300 feet of shipwreck. So a little bit about these guys. This is Alan Litchfield. He was a lumberman. Comes into the record as a lumberman in Michigan. He comes out as a young guy in the age of 20, 22, and develops what was for a brief time one of the most extensive and technologically advanced lumber mills in Western Michigan. He built a schooner called the Lumberman that sank in Wisconsin, and for years we were stymied in the pre-heavy internet years, really who this guy was, because the only records and secondary sources that were published spelled his name wrong, and so people couldn't find out who he was. And finally, I did focus and track it down. And one of the questions in my mind is, how was this young guy out in the West on the frontier? What was he doing there? How did he have, this advanced lumber mill? Where did he get the capital and the know-how to build what was a really, as the archaeology proves out, a pretty spectacular and advanced vessel? It turns out it's another story of cosmopolitanism and connection with the West, or between West and East. Litchfield's brother-in-law is this man here on the right. His name's Donald Mackay. And if you study maritime history, or if you were living in the maritime world of America from 1840 to 1870, this guy is, he is the, Frank Sinatra or the Beyonce of shipbuilders. He's credited being the most advanced shipbuilder in the country. And it turns out that Litchfield's father was Mackay's right-hand man, and his older sister became his second wife. Essentially, Litchfield grew up in the most progressive shipyard in America, and he brought these skills with him to the Great Lakes and put them to work. Many people did, but he's certainly at the top of the tree. This is an image of the lumberman in the back, and in front, and I'm spacing the name, which I have also dove on. They're both really kind of distinctive vessels, and I found this image after years of not having any contemporary images in an old map at the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, and they're tied up to the lumber docks. And you can see that this connection between ship and sea. Generated a lot of wealth, and I'm going to push ahead because we don't really have time. But the lumberman was built for the Ferry family of Western Michigan. They were kind of the, if lumber in Michigan had Kennedys, they would have been the Kennedys. Thomas Ferry was one of the owners. He ends up in the Senate of the United States. His brother is killed at Gettysburg, and he remains very connected with Alan Litchfield, the shipbuilder, whose fortunes fail during the Civil War. He loses his mill, and he goes into the army, where he amasses a great record as a cavalry commander, but ends up as a prisoner of war and is essentially broken in many ways. But through Thomas Ferry, this connection forged through the lumberman, Litchfield is appointed Consul General to British East India. He is America's diplomat to India's British Empire from the early 1870s to 1880. Again, this cosmopolitan set of connections, and he collected a lot of things, but he gets as far as India. A live Hindu bride in full costume, only 15 cents. The next cosmopolitan guy is this is Captain Hartley Hatch, who was the owner and captain of a vessel called the Kate Kelly that we talk about in the book. It was it was a canal schooner, meaning it was designed to go through the Welland Canal between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And I bring this in not because of the shipwreck, which is really important and interesting, but the stories that I found in trying to understand who Hatch is, and trying to make sense of a guy that was very experienced and yet bought an old schooner in 1894 and dies. Hatch in 1878 is hired to be captain of a schooner called the Mary L. Higgy, another canal schooner. And he is hired to take the Higgy, and they sail out from the Great Lakes up to St. Lawrence River. They collect, get a cargo of lumber, and they take it across the Atlantic. They go down the Welland Canal and out to the Atlantic, and they go not to Europe, but they go to South Africa. Sail the Great Lakes Canal centerboard schooner all the way to South Africa, where reports of it reaching Cape Town are sent back to the United States. In Cape Town, he's chartered by the British government to carry native soldiers up to be involved in the early stages of the Zulu Wars. Then, of course, he sails back. He makes a number of trips, only one to South Africa, but in that trip, he goes beyond Cape Town and sails a Great Lakes schooner all the way into the southern Indian Ocean. Last guy, and he has a prominent role in the book, is James Davidson. Built the longest and largest wooden ships on the Great Lakes, and some of the longest in the world. An innovative guy, a millionaire, an orphan who educated himself and took advantage of changing frontier conditions. Davidson was born in Buffalo in 1841, is orphaned probably from cholera, and goes to work on the waterfront of the Buffalo Harbor, where he rows guys out to ships and back, where he clearly got to know ships and sailors from all parts of the world. He educates himself through public school and all kinds of things, but in 1859 he heads to New York, where he ends up signing on to a packet, the Black Ball Line packet Great Western. And for people who study Atlantic maritime history, the packet ships are really the zenith, in many ways, that and the clipper ships of wooden shipbuilding in America. The packet ships carried a lot of the business between New York and Liverpool and other places, and the Black Ball Line is the most famous of them all. It was also some of the toughest sailing. These were the best massed ship captains afloat, and some of the toughest and nastiest crews. And Davidson does time on the Great Western, and then signs on to a clipper ship, where he sails also into the Indian Ocean and India, carrying railroad iron, and comes on back and spends time in London and in Liverpool in the most advanced docks. And he brings these ideas, and this is the kind of the underlying thrust of all of that, is these people that made a difference on the Great Lakes. Many of them made a splash. They did so because they were cosmopolitan, and because they went out and they embraced the many currents of ideas that were literally floating around the Atlantic world, those knowledge and connections and practices, and brought them back to the Great Lakes and put their own regional spin on it. And it was the things that Davidson learned from being abroad, as well as the apprenticeships he did in Buffalo shipyards and things like that, that gave him the capacity to push the size of wooden ships on the Great Lakes beyond anything people had seen before or since. He was also a tremendous mariner. He would go out and he would test all of his ships. He would be the first captain out with them. So he's very unusual on that, but he's not unusual in this cosmopolitan stuff that they were doing. This is shipbuilding at the Davidson Yard. This is a 341-foot long schooner barge hull. Today, there's all kinds of shipwrecks and material heritage that relate to all of these guys. Davidson's ships, about 5 or 6 of them, maybe 7, sank or were otherwise lost in Wisconsin. This is from the Appomattox, which was the longest wooden steamer, a steam freighter ever built for American service. It was lost in Milwaukee. and you can see this is the keelson, the backbone of the ship, and going right off here this is actually steel belts. These are cross bracing back here. Again, ideas like the cross bracing were pioneered perhaps on the ocean or not, but they certainly find their way into the Great Lakes and very early into Davidson's ships. And he integrates, again, iron and so these industrial materials into the abundant wood of the Great Lakes, and builds the largest ships, extremely successful fleets, and becomes fabulously rich, while also pioneering beet farming in Wisconsin and places like that. That's just sort of the highlights, some of the highlights of the stories that we tell. I want to close with the idea that, of course, shipwrecks, and you didn't get much shipwrecks here. Shipwrecks in and of themselves are sad things, but they can tell us a lot of stories. They can give us that link. They're pieces of the past that we can use as entry points into a much more rich and complex and fulfilling story. Most voyages succeeded. The sea, whether it was the inland sea or others, were pathways to a better life for many people. And it's not all about shipwrecks and sadness. I'm going to close with this picture. I came in with my story, and I'll end with it a little bit. This is the Equator. It's a Pacific Northwest Puget Sound seine boat built in 1923. And the guy up in the corner is my cousin, and it's his grandson. And the Equator was built by our great grandfather again in 1923. Unbroken family of maritime heritage going on down through the generations. We see aspects of that on the Great Lakes, and we can see it in other areas of the maritime world. And it's this living maritime heritage and history that really attracts me the most. Shipwrecks are important. Shipwrecks are extraordinarily interesting, but it's the lives of the people and their achievements that I think are of the most importance. Thank you. Stop the
John,
share.
thank you. Thank you for such a wonderfully informative and really visual adventure of the ships. And I didn't know that they went so far beyond, the Great Lakes. So we can open up for questions now. And
okay.
yep. And I want to thank John. And if you're interested in John's book, Stories from the Wreckage, I have posted the link to where you can purchase that from the Wisconsin Historical Society. So feel free to ask questions in the chat or turn your sound on and your camera, and we'll go ahead and see if anybody has any questions.
So, are you there?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Just wanted to say I really appreciated this, John. It's a wonderful guide. I haven't seen someone do so much the emphasis on the crewmen and the lives involved. So that's a very good approach.
Thank you.
I guess one more thing that for about 20 years now, I'm now a retired engineer and captain on for Lake Geneva Cruise Lines here, and I drive the steam yacht Louise. And it's amazing to think of that Geneva Lake is only like 30 miles from Lake Michigan, but it actually drains into the Mississippi.
Yeah, it's a beautiful lake though. There's some interesting. There are some interesting wrecks of excursion steamers and things in the lake.
Definitely. And happily, I mean, all these years, I would much rather be on Geneva than Lake Michigan. That Michigan, she's kind of a moody girl.
Oh, I've had some bad days there. Yeah, I'll take the lake. The smaller the body of water, the better pretty much for me anymore, most of the time.
That sounds good. I'll let someone else have a shot at it if they want here.
Well, these Zoom things are hard to
Yeah.
do this stuff.
Yeah, hard to. I was thinking, you know, the children know how to run this stuff a lot better than I do.
Yeah.
And the personal.
I can hear somebody trying to get through, but I can't hear them.
Yeah, just let me know if anybody has a question. You can say your name and your question. This is Michelle, the director. And John, maybe you could talk a little bit out of the wreckages that you've seen and featured in your book. Which one is the most historically significant, do you think?
Well, which children do you love the most? Which child do you love the most? Yeah, you know, each of the wrecks that are delved into in detail in the book, you know, of the Wisconsin wrecks, are representative of types of vessels that had a lot to do on the Great Lakes. But I would, in terms of the different periods, the steamer Niagara up off of Port Washington, which built in 1846 but burnt in 1856, you know, the worst, you know, terrible transportation tragedy. That is of national historical significance. There's no question about it for its engineering, and it represents a lot. The one that tells the most surprising stories is a vessel called the Lumberman, and I write quite a lot about that. And again, every one of these vessels, and really I've never had a shipwreck that didn't do this, but these vessels, you know, brought to life and light histories and stories that people had forgotten, histories that we didn't even know existed, and connections. And certainly the Lumberman, which again links the Michigan lumber frontier and Great Lakes shipbuilding with the revolutionary developments at the peak of wooden shipbuilding in America. That's pretty darn historical. So again, all of these are significant. Most significant, don't know, but Niagara's right up there, and the Lumberman has those two things have taught me a tremendous amount about the sea, inland and ocean, that I didn't know before.
Thank you, John. Did you
yeah.
see you have two chat questions over on
do.
the slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do, and I'll go with the first one on were there any particularly common causes of wrecks on the Great Lakes? And of course there are, and you've listed a number of them. One of the big elements with the lakes is that it's although they are large, they are quite confined. When you're out, particularly in a sailing vessel, but really on a big vessel as well, and a large storm comes up, and it's pushing you someplace you don't want to go, you want to have sea room. You want to have places that you can run, and you can do that when you are well offshore in the ocean. But the Great Lakes are lee shores everywhere, so there's a lot of particularly in the age of sail, a lot of wrecks that are groundings where they're pushed up on the shoreline. You know, in other places where you have shipping lanes coming together, not so much in Wisconsin, but in other places, collisions are significant. Structural failure is far rarer, and you know, if that occurs, it's usually, you know, but not always associated with a really aging vessel and some, you know, long-term economic hardship. The next question is, I'm researching a shipwreck of 1864 said to be owned by the Higgy family. Do you know if there's a connection to the Higgy ship you mentioned tonight? Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know that the Alvin Clark is very famous and older, but the Higgy family is, yeah, I'm quite sure that it is connected. Yeah, he worked for the Higgies later, and when Hatch and the Kate Kelly go down in I believe it's 1894, one of the people that says the most about him is one of the Higgy family. the coverage of that, of the loss of the Kate Kelly in the Chicago newspapers, pretty extraordinary. There were a lot of schooners that were going down in those days, but they devote a lot of columns over a couple of days to the loss of that vessel for reasons beyond what I talked about today that you can find out in the book.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from John tonight. Does anyone have just one more before we sign off?
Is there a way I could get in touch with you, John? I've got a video clip sent to me by a friend who was an engineer on one of the freighters out in the lakes for years. And
Sure.
there's some beautiful aerial photography.
Yeah, absolutely. I will actually put this out because I don't mind being contacted. My email at the university is so now everybody's got it.
All right.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions and your attention and putting up with my not too comfortable work with this technology. And I hope you guys have a great week.
I think you did really well. Thank you, everyone, and stay safe. And thank you for attending tonight.
Well, thanks for offering it.
You're welcome. And please watch for other great events that will have other virtual authors. Coming up in February, we have several authors and an aerospace photographer. So watch our website for details. And John, take care. Everyone stay healthy, and thank you very much.
Thank you.